thank you first of all to Lisa, to Glenn, Dave, to all of you for giving me the opportunity of presenting some ideas on which I'm working already quite a while, but it's not always so easy to find an audience where people are also focused on similar subjects. So first of all, thank you also for having me here. But then I must also thank Arshita, because she in part already said the things that I wanted to say, to explain. So that's fine, because so I may also focus on another part, on the other side of the coin. And because today I would like to introduce what I call the integral cosmology of Sri Aurobindo. It's not his name. He didn't call it like that, because we must not forget that Sri Aurobindo was first of all a spiritual teacher. He was a yogi, a mystic, eventually a poet. But I don't see him so much as a philosopher. However, in his mystic vision, he had this vision, cosmological vision, that therefore I labeled as an integral cosmology, because in my view, it can integrate the Western and the Eastern points of view. And I focused in particular on the philosophy of mind, or the so-called consciousness studies. May I, because I have some slides, may I share the screen? I see that I'm disabled. Is it possible to share the screen and share some slides?
Okay,
so, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, I see. Okay. So it's an introduction to the perspective from the perspective of consciousness studies, because, as I said, first of all, his teaching is of a spiritual kind, but it is, in my view, terribly interesting for the modern so-called philosophy of mind, also consciousness studies. Why is that? Because I think that our shift from our society that goes from a strictly mental paradigm, mentalistic society based on only the analytic reason and on a very materialistic point of view and perception of society, to a post-material form of society, and going beyond the rational mental paradigm, will very much depend from these sort of things. Nowadays, it is perceived as just philosophy, but I believe that this will be one of the key features that will lead us in the future, and perhaps not so near, but distant future, of a so-called, what Sri Aurobindo called the, he had this vision of a spiritual society. So let me first of all explain what it is about, so that we place Sri Aurobindo in the context of the Western philosophy of mind. As you already know, probably, I suppose that most of you know that there has always been in philosophy this distinction and this discussion, this philosophical discussion about the mind-body dualism, or the mind-body monism, or if the brain and the mind are the same thing or not. As you know, René, already, this is an old discussion, it dates back to René Descartes, who said we have a mind who is an immaterial entity and a body, so essentially. However, this is no longer a form of understanding of ourselves. Nowadays, neuroscience and modern science in general, biology and so on, say we are just the brain and the mind is the same thing. And it's the form of material monism, where essentially it tells you that we are just biological robots, to put it bluntly, and there is nothing more. And this is actually still a prevailing point of view, but it is changing, and we will see how. Then in the 1990s, and so not so long ago, so about 30 years ago and so, came the neuroscientific revolution, where people were convinced that now with new forms, or with new technologies, with brain scanning technologies, with EEGs and whatever, we will be able to reveal the secret of consciousness, how the brain produces this strange, immaterial entity that is consciousness. What has been reached so far after 30 years is there have been some successes. We now have mapped the brain in a very detail. We can nowadays see how it functions and so on. These tools have become powerful diagnostic tools. However, when it comes to the treatment of mental disorders, there has the expectations, this kind of research did not meet the expectations until now. And what is perhaps more important for us now here is the philosophers of mind, the neuroscientists, philosophers in general, wanted to find where are these so-called neural correlates of consciousness in our brain, which region is responsible for creating our phenomenal, so-called phenomenal consciousness. That's the feelings and perceptions that we have. One day, this guy came along, who is David Chalmers, who made a question. He asked a question, a very simple question. Here you see he looks like a rocker. I think he is also, by the way, but he's one of the most famous and renewed philosophers of mind in the world. And he came up with a simple question: how can a particular physical aggregate, that is our brain, which is made of unconscious matter, become conscious? How can unconscious matter, insentient matter, that has no mind, that is supposed to have no aim, no goal, nothing, a purely material aggregate, by its aggregation in neurons, cells, and the whole brain, become an entity that has experiences, feelings, perceptions, a so-called phenomenal consciousness, that is, that there is a subjective experience that arises from something that is supposed to have no experience at all. There is, so to speak, an explanatory gap between, for example, our perceptions of colors, qualities, and what is a purely quantitative science. This led to an explosion. So I don't, of course, I don't ask you to read all this stuff, but just to show you in one slide the explosion of the theories of consciousness that followed in the last 10, 20 years. You see there is a plethora of theories of consciousness that try at any cost to explain this strange, ineffable, apparently immaterial thing that we call consciousness, sentience, feelings, emotions, etc. How this brain can lead to this immaterial, apparently immaterial entity that is our mind. And by the way, mind and consciousness. However, the failure of modern science, of modern neuroscience, of modern material monism to give a satisfying answer led, however, to a revival of an attempt to see the things from an opposite point of view. And this, where we don't put matter as fundamental, but we have put consciousness as something fundamental. And I hear sounds in the background. I think it's Lisa. If you can mute yourself. So the point is, how is no longer the question, how could matter lead to a conscious experience? But let's see these things from the opposite side. Let's place consciousness as something fundamental and then see how consciousness arises in and through matter. And this led to what I call the revival of post-material theories of consciousness. And we are now experiencing something of a sort of metaphysical shift. And this is clearly seen, for example, of the revival of panpsychism. Panpsychism is a metaphysical theory that is also not new. It dates back to Gottfried Leibniz, who had this idea of, he developed this theory of ontology, but which was essentially forgotten because everyone was convinced that material monism would finally reign and win over everything. And here I placed just this guy here is Philip Goff. He's a modern philosopher, a British philosopher, who has resurrected this kind of view. Panpsychism by the means that all is psyche. Pan stands for all is a form of mind, all is a form of consciousness, even matter, even particles, even atoms, molecules. There is some sort of subconscious proto-consciousness, so to speak. But this is a reductionist point of view. Others, like probably you have heard of him, and Bernardo Castro, he's quite famous guy on YouTube. You find him all over the place, and who introduced the modern conception of philosophical idealism, continuing a tradition that was introduced by Arthur Schopenhauer already in the 18th, 19th century, which is the opposite view. This is not the reductionist view, but the view that we must consider the possibility that there can be a cosmic consciousness, that not single particles are consciousness, but the whole cosmos, the whole universe is a conscious entity, and that expresses itself in us as individuals. On a similar line, you can find also the theories called cosmopsychism. It's very similar, and that these have also already a connection to Indian philosophy. And this is proposed by Itai Shani. He is an Israeli philosopher. And here we come slowly at the point where Western philosophy begins to go beyond its own boundaries, so to speak. We should not see these boundaries. We are trying to integrate them. But actually, the problem that I see, however, with these approaches, which in a certain sense I welcome, because I am not a material monist, I'm very sympathetic to these approaches of modern science, modern philosophy, Western philosophy, but there are some deficiencies. Well, first of all, okay, here I wanted also to, how do these paradigms see the relationship between the brain and consciousness? William James already, for example, he spoke of this idea using a metaphor that the brain is not just something that produces consciousness, but has a transmissive function. And this transmissive function, he used the metaphor of the prism. Imagine a light beam that goes through a prism and is diffracted in different colors. If you impair the prism, the colors disappear. But you don't deduce from that that the prism produces the light. This is a correlation causation fallacy. Here, he used this metaphor to say the same of the brain. He said the brain is not something that produces consciousness. It is something that transmits it. Yeah. And of course, these things are coming up again in the modern philosophy of mind, the Western philosophy of mind, but they were almost forgotten. On a similar line, I would say the same line of reasoning, argued also Aldous Huxley, who, by the way, he had his trips with some psychedelic drugs and so on, and had some mystic experience, and said, no, I came to the conclusion that the brain is a sort of reducing valve of a mind at large, that is a universal consciousness, but it is not something that produces that consciousness. And our brain is just sort of reducing valve, otherwise we would be overwhelmed by this mind at large. Well, I found the metaphor of James perhaps a bit more elegant, but it's interesting that they both came to similar conclusions. So that's where the modern philosophy of Western philosophy of mind came, with few exceptions, which you all already know, and you are certainly much more expert in these fields than I am. Jen Jepser added also an evolutionary dimension to the problem of consciousness. And also Taylor Desjardins did the same. They saw also this evolutionary dimension, which is, however, still missing in some way. So maybe we can then discuss this, but I didn't find many people who introduced in this metaphysical understanding of consciousness also a metaphysical understanding of evolution. And the two things are related because we are speaking of the evolution of consciousness. No? What is also here, and this I consider this a bit to use a Jepserian nomenclature, as a deficient side of the Western philosophy, with these two exceptions that I could find. What is also deficient in a certain sense is that we are still speaking of one-dimensional cosmologies. Material monism says all is matter. It's only one dimension. Idealism, the philosophical idealism or cosmopsychism, that's what I was speaking about previously with Kastrup and Shani. Yeah, they say all is mind. So we are still in a one-dimensional world. Whereas we know already from the times of the Vedas, also already in the Vedic text, there was this metaphysical idea of the human being, not just a physical body and a soul, which would be dualism would be a sort of two-dimensional cosmology. But they had a multi-dimensional cosmology. That's my way of saying it. They didn't speak in this way, but essentially that's the meaning. They said there's not only a physical body and there's not only a mind body. So there was already the Cartesian distinction between mind and body, but there is also a life body. And that's also interesting. Is life something purely explainable in purely materialistic concept, in a purely materialistic conception? According to these cosmologies, not. And what is also interesting that they already spoke of a gnosis body or a bliss body, that is that beyond mind, there are also other levels of consciousness and other cognitive faculties that we have. And so another aspect, a deficient side, that we are a bit still in a sort of Spinozian universe. That's my take. Not everyone would agree with this, but when we are speaking of this metaphysical understanding of consciousness from these Western philosophers, they don't go much beyond a pantheistic view of the universe, where, pantheism, according to Spinoza and so on, and there were also others who said God and nature is one thing. But what about panentheism? That is an extension which integrates, in a certain sense, pantheism, but goes a little bit beyond and extends this idea where this universal consciousness contains nature. Nature cannot exist, that is also matter, and we and our mind and our life cannot exist with this universal consciousness, but not the other way around. This universal consciousness could also exist without nature. So putting these things together, this is, in my view, that what I felt always, that these aspects here, these deficient aspects here, are the deficient side of the Western philosophy of mind. And my aim was to take up the integral cosmology of Sri Aurobindo, because in his cosmology, all these aspects are integrated without denying the scientific perspective, without denying the modern science, modern evolutionary biology, modern neuroscience, modern philosophy of mind, but goes beyond. And I wrote about this an article that has been recently accepted for publication. It's still not out there, but if you wish, I can send you a PDF of this. It should come out in the next weeks. And where he had this integral vision, which is, in my view, extremely important and interesting for these consciousness studies. And this is something that still has not been studied enough, in my view, and is worth mentioning because, as I said, will be one of the main aspects of the shift from a mental paradigm to an integral paradigm. So let me just very quickly sum up or especially say what is missing on one side and what can Sri Aurobindo contribute to complement on the other side. He had these conceptions of planes and parts of being. Parts are the individuation in us, in an individual or in matter, and the planes are the universal aspects, the parts of being, and the planes, the universal planes. For example, I have a body. It is an individuation in matter, but there is also a universe, physical universe. So there is a physical part, which is a living being, and a physical universal aspect on a universal plane. And this is interesting because you can also extend this idea also to life. There is being, a life in the being, but there is also a universal plane of existence. The same for the mind. There is a mental being, which whoever, we, us, or human beings, but there is also a universal plane, that is this universal consciousness. And then there are also these higher forms of cognition that we can see, that we are going to see next. Interesting is also the idea of the psychic being. That is the idea that there exists an evolutionary soul that transmigrates from through a process of reincarnation, from incarnation to incarnation, and evolves. The idea of an evolutionary soul is also something that in the Western psychology, there are some people who talk about that, but I think we can learn a lot from Sri Aurobindo in this sense. As already Arshita already hinted at, there is an involution of the spirit into matter, and then an evolution. So here this is not in contradiction with modern science, but sees the so-called Darwinian evolution from a different perspective, as first an involution of the spirit in matter, and then an evolution of the spirit in and through, out of matter. It's a little different perspective, but that is integral in the sense that it's perfectly in line with what we already know from a scientific perspective. Another point is that he said, not only conceived, it was a mystical experience. For Sri Aurobindo, all these things were not just philosophy. It was a mystical experience. He said there are also a mind in the cells. This is also very interesting because modern science confirms this. Cells have no brain, and yet they have some proto-mental capacities. They have some sort of cognition. This has been tested and improved scientifically in the last 5-10 years, I think. Then there is a triple transformation. This is a yogic part, where there is a psychic transformation, a spiritual transformation, and also, finally, the physical transformation. This, which should lead to the gnostic being that is the next evolutionary being and the divine life. So what modern Western philosophy sees is this, what he calls the lower hemisphere. Whereas if we want to take the integral view, from the point of view Sri Aurobindo, there is also a higher hemisphere that has been essentially ignored by the modern philosophers, I think. And it is time to integrate this. And if you want to have then the details how and in what sense, you can then go through my article. Okay, this was, I think, the essence of what I was trying to convey. If you want to have more information or want to have contact with me, here is my website, blog, etc., etc. Also my books, what I have published recently, a couple of articles more and so on. Thank you very much for your attention.